as our speaker. Mel was born in Lakeland, Florida. He lived on a small family farm. He was a dedicated musician throughout his school years. He joined the Navy at age 18. Wow. After submarine training in Groton, Connecticut, Mel was stationed on a submarine in Hawaii. After 10 years in the Navy, Mel left the Navy and started working for Lockheed Martin. Mel traveled the world as an engineer working on Navy ships in the US and abroad. He left Lockheed in 1996. In 1997, he worked as a boiler technician at Yellowstone National Park. After driving across the US a few times, Mel took a job with Gulfstream Aerospace in Savannah, Georgia. He eventually returned to Lockheed in Huntsville, Alabama in 2003. There he met his spouse, John Pruitt, who is our piano man, and the current president of our church. Mel and John have been members of MLUUC since 2018. Mel retired from Lockheed in 2017 and moved with John to their home in Blue Ridge. Mel now devotes his time to loving John and their two super hunting Norwegian elk hounds, Rags and Bo, the two protectors of the gardens and all-around scoundrels. Thanks to the support and love of this congregation, Mel was encouraged to apply and was added to the pulpit directory as a Unitarian layperson for the UUA Southern Region. As such, Mel is eligible to speak at UU churches throughout the Southern Region and has been a recent speaker at the UU congregation in Sandy Springs and at the PFLAG chapter in Blairsville. The title of Mel's talk today is Black History Month, Othering the Bourgeoisie and My Passage to Understanding. By the way, Mel is the best baker we have, and whenever he brings something, it's gone like a light.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
You may need to take a few deep breaths before we start. I think my big awakening began when I moved in with John. I had never considered myself a racist for decades, but I didn't truly begin my search of who I was or how I was going to exist in this new life until Carla and Ronald McDonald, our neighbors in Huntsville, Alabama. Before them, I had lived a very segregated and alone existence. And, I didn't feel lonely, but I just didn't interact with people outside my family and those that I worked with. And I worked and traveled in an environment that is predominantly straight, cis, white males. I had worked with maybe 3 or 4 non-white engineers, but that was over a career of 35 years. Boy, was I naive. Shortly after moving in with John, I was outside pruning and picking roses, and now, mind you, I hadn't met anyone in the neighborhood, and they all knew Marilyn from John's previous life. So you can imagine the side eye when Carla and her daughter Casey saw me picking roses. I introduced myself as John's new roommate and told them to help themselves to roses anytime they would like, and I could see it in their eyes. Soon after, Carla and I would spend evenings on the patio or their porch sipping wine. I introduced them to new flavors and cuisines, and in the beginning, they would question. I remember inviting them over for dumplings, and Carla said, "Mel, we don't like dumplings." She, of course, meant the old standard of chicken and dumplings, and I, in fact, meant Chinese dumplings. After a few years, they just began to trust and would say, "Yes, we will come for dinner." But to make a long story short, John was trying to hit the market to sell his house, and it sold much faster than anticipated. We rented an apartment for a while, but my travels to Saudi Arabia began tearing me apart, and it was Ron and Carla that opened their home to me. John moved full-time to Blue Ridge, and I lived with them for quite a few months between my time in country. It was a horrible stretch for me dealing with the men on my work teams, and John spent many nights via FaceTime talking me off the ledge. But this was also a time when Carla was recovering from breast cancer. The hours she and I spent in solace on her back porch helped both of us get through one of those rough spells. I would occasionally cook for them, and I met all of their family. It was a gathering spot for brothers, sisters, children, and littles. Just sitting and being a part of them changed me. They are always at the top of my gratitude list, and I dedicate this to them today because I miss them terribly. All of you know that I was raised in the South. When I say Florida, the images of white sandy beaches and Mickey Mouse come flying into your brain, but that was not my Florida. It still isn't my Florida. My childhood was swamp marshes and orange groves. It was horse ranches and strawberry fields, tomato farms in Ruskin, and the county was dotted with small family gardens where we picked peas and greens. Until I was old enough to drive, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I'd been to the beach. You see, my kinfolk were migrants. My grandparents came south from Alabama to look for work and a better life for their family. Back then, they were the ones doing the back-breaking jobs in the fields. They had been sharecroppers and such, and of course, I was oblivious to this for most of my life. Years ago, before retiring, I worked with a man at Lockheed named John Fleischman. He was born and raised on Long Island. He would tell stories of being raised in farming country, and I would roll my eyes at him and say, "There ain't farms in New York." The irony is that there probably are more farms on Long Island now. My Florida doesn't exist anymore. The way of life from my childhood is forever gone. Now, where I ran through the orange groves stand retirement communities and golf courses. The 25-acre fish hatchery that provided so many days of enjoyment while fishing in the ditches and creeks has been gone for decades. We still have our small acreage. It seemed so big when I was young, but it's mostly surrounded still by cousins. But Publix is now within walking distance, and there's a Taco Bell at the end of our road. So much of this I have fond memories of, and I always will. However, that life did not prepare me for life. It didn't reveal to me what had happened before me. It didn't give me the skills to engage with others outside my own kind. As I said a few years ago, I had not been taught how to self-govern. I didn't know the sordid past. I had zero awareness of the inequalities that are still perpetrated to this day. We didn't mingle among races back then. I have tried to remember the first time I spoke to a non-white person. Possibly it was junior high school, but I'm pretty sure I was in senior high school and probably 16 years old before I ever even spoke to a person who wasn't white. His name was Norris Riggs. He was an amazing trumpet player in our band, and This was in 1977. It was just 8 years after the all-black Rochelle High School had been closed in 1969. My hometown newspaper wrote, according to the Lakeland Public Library archives, black high school students had to attend classes beyond the county line through the 1920s because there were no high schools for them. That changed in 1928 when Washington Park High School, later renamed Rochelle, opened. But it was only the 6th high school for black students in the state of Florida. Now we have to jump all the way to 1954 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka case that separate but equal education was unconstitutional and that all children should go to school together. It took another 10 years for Polk County Public Schools to put a plan together and another 5 years to implement it after Althea Mills sued so her son Herman could attend the all-white Winter Haven High School and for all Polk County schools to be integrated. Can you imagine? I guess, based on where we live, it's possible to see how that could happen. It makes me weary that the children being raised here in our mountains are probably not being prepared. They too will emerge not knowing the truths and being unable to live with those who have experienced things they never will. When I left home and joined the Navy at 18, it wasn't due to patriotism. It wasn't to get an education. It was to escape, to run. I have a clear memory of me when I was 5 years old, sitting in the woods near our home and thinking I didn't belong there. Having no concept outside our country road, I didn't know where I should be or how to get there, but joining the Navy was the best decision I ever made. The first friend I had that wasn't white was named Jody. He was a second class stationed in Groton, Connecticut, and he was part of my gay crowd. One of the men I would spend time in New York with or go clubbing on the weekends. He was one of the men that helped me begin my life, showing me how to hide in plain sight, how to be gay in the Navy, which is very different from life as a civilian. But he is the one I credit for breaking the spell. He's the one that I got to know and began to see life differently. He introduced me to Miss Kitty. Kitty was a cop on the base police force, and he took me to her open house Christmas party. It was the first party I ever attended as an openly gay man, even though I couldn't yet be open. I can still see what was, to me, her fancy, chic home. Our family still had bare floors and only one side of the walls had sheetrock and the other was still bare studs. When I close my eyes, I remember the lacy smoke hanging in the air and the smell of hashish and wine. Then there she was, so tall and dark, beautiful, like Grace Jones. I'm unsure what I babbled at her, but I'm sure it was probably something like, "Merry Christmas!" Boy, was I a bumpkin. From then on, she called me Country Mel. She was an open ally, fully supportive of the gays, openly supportive. There were a few times when she rescued two of us from trouble too. I haven't thought about this moment in a long time, but it was one of the most pivotal and emotional memories for me. You see, Standing there with his arm around her was a white man, her husband of about 20 years. I cannot remember his name, unfortunately, but here I was, a boy of 18 that had just 6 months ago left a home where my father would scream obscenities at Tyne Daly if he saw her on the television. You know, I'm glad that John isn't around when I do a lot of my writing. He knows we use a lot of tissues, though. Friends, I have looked at these memories, these glimpses into my life many times throughout the years. They would come around when I needed them, but this time they came to me from a whole new path. These were my butterfly wings. The ones that it is said, when they flap their wings, it is felt 1,000,000 miles away. They were my ripples. How many of you know the band Faces, David Bowie? They sang Ooh La La. I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger, right? Don't we all wish that? I asked many friends and family when they remembered the first non-white person they spoke to. Every single one said high school. Now, I want anyone in good faith to ask me why we needed Black History Month. When I graduated with honors from high school, I couldn't tell you one single accomplishment by a person of color, except maybe George Washington Carver, and that's because he grew peanuts like many people in my family. I reckon you could throw Pocahontas in there, but I now know most of what I was taught were half-truths to fit the narrative. Excuse me. According to the Library of Congress archives, the roots of Black History Month in America began in 1915. Dr. Carter G. Woodson started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. However, it wasn't until February 3rd, 1975, that President Ford issued his message on the observance of Black History Week. He said, "It is most appropriate that Americans set aside a week to recognize the important contribution made to our nation's life and culture by our Black citizens. With the growth of the civil rights movement has come a healthy awareness on the part of all of us of achievements that have too long been obscured and unsung. Emphasis on these achievements in our schools and colleges and in daily community life places timely perspective the benefits of working together as brothers and sisters, regardless of race, religion, or national origin, for the general well-being of all our society. In this spirit, I urge my fellow citizens to be mindful of the valuable message conveyed to us during the celebration of this week." Gerald R. Ford. Now we still have to jump all the way forward to 1986 before Congress passed legislation designating February as National Black Afro-American History Month. This law noted that February 1st, 1986 would mark the beginning of the 60th annual public and private salute to Black history. The law further directed the president to issue a proclamation calling on the people of the United States to observe February 1986 as Black History Month with the appropriate ceremonies and activities. 1986. I mean, heck, it had only been 367 years since the first Africans were brought to our shores. The first arrived in shackles and chains on August 25th, 1619, in Jamestown, Virginia. By this time in 1986, I had completed my first tour of duty in the Navy and re-enlisted. I had met so many unlike myself. I had depended on those around me in camaraderie and as shipmates, but you know what? We would have to jump all the way to 1994 before we reached the point where Florida finally mandated that African American history be included in school curriculum. 1994. I was well on my way to being 40 years old. Let those of you who know men that like to change that age line up to the right. We are now 3 decades past this legislation, and data continues to indicate that only 11 of the 67 school districts meet the minimum benchmarks. This is the heart of the MAGA conservative movement. The general philosophy is you can't make me learn about or live with anyone I don't want to. It's what they mean when they scream, "Make America Great Again." They have hijacked the liberal idea of equality, but are using it as a weapon to eradicate teaching the accomplishments of our fellow Americans. As we now know, they erase the accomplishments we have made through diversity and inclusion. They stand behind the ruse that they weren't alive during slavery and it's the past and should dismiss them from participation. Of course, they don't acknowledge the continuing efforts to whitewash our past to this very day. Our opposition to their trickery is why they call us woke. They wish to retreat into a time they felt comfortable not knowing the contributions and sacrifices of our citizens. I stand here today saying I am awake now. You can remove the word gay. You can remove diversity and inclusion. Hit me with your best shot. I am ready to stand in my wokeness. When I'm preparing to speak on a topic, I do a lot of reading and research, and the algorithm gets me sucked in. I saw during the election cycle so many young black men on podcasts taking the Trump train, if you will. I could not grasp it. My brain would begin to smoke and descend into wonder. How could the likes of Clarence Thomas and Candace Owens and Condoleezza Rice sit on that side of the table? Then I found a paper written by Professor Tyrone Williams. He's a professor of English literature at Xavier University in Cincinnati, and he wrote this paper titled "The Problem of Black History Month." He says Black History Month celebrations are supposed to make a difference in the perceptions and attitudes of blacks and whites. For both blacks and whites, Black history offers a glimpse of the achievements of culture in all its cultural forms: African, Caribbean, European, American. As such, it offers cultural touchstones as a corrective to prejudice and stereotyping. He said, if you view Black History Month the same as other ethnic celebrations and holidays like Oktoberfest or Hanukkah or St. Patrick's Day, you notice 3 things. One, it is celebrated over the course of a month and not just a day or weekend. It appears as a privilege given solely for the simple fact that blacks are the largest minority in America and, unlike other minorities, suffered the cruelest system of slavery in modern history. And three, by creating this separate holiday, we acknowledge the cultural norm that is in place all the other days of the year. Mr. Williams said, in this respect, ethnic groups delude themselves when they believe their annual celebrations counter the annual holidays of the dominant racial, religious, and gender group like Christmas, July 4th, and Memorial Day. For in many ways, these holidays of the dominant ethnic group are redundant, overdetermined. They are special affirmations of what is already apparent every day of every year in the media and cultural institutions of America: the superiority of WASP values. For example, two of the three majority cultural holidays, Christmas and Independence, celebrate consumerism in the guise of Christianity and jingoism in the guise of patriotism. The themes of all three holidays are preached at us in the form of newspaper editorials, advertisements, political speeches, toys, games, public education, and the list goes on. Their message: obey Christian values, buy lots of stuff, and be willing to die for your freedom. He continued to say, when we bind our values to specific historical, theological, economic, and political ideals, it is assumed to be the natural interests of all Americans, regardless of race. If so, that makes the strategy for improving the welfare of blacks as a group flawed, which then leaves the value of the civil rights movement open to question. Professor Harold Cruse argued that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 implied the impotency of the 14th and 15th Amendment as applied to black citizens. He thought it acknowledged that blacks were not covered under the Constitution. He said such separatism is self-defeating, intellectually crippling, and morally bankrupt, since it is the condition that stereotypes and prejudices about the other calcify into indelible truths. For blacks, the implementation of Black History Month represents a retreat on the front lines of cultural warfare. And yes, he said warfare. Professor Cruse said, having failed to implement black values, practices, and achievements in the arts, sciences, and business curricula of the predominant learning institutions, we settle for the crumbs of a Black History Month. This is how they appease us, by continuing the otherness. I'm going to step in as myself here and tell you the first time I was exposed to the feeling of othering. It was around 2000 or 2001, and I worked with a young engineer named Michael. I was telling a story about my friend from Savannah named Marcus. I said he was a black guy, and Michael instantly jumped in and said, "Why does he need to be black?" Huh? Why do you need to tell us he is black? He and I had several discussions about this over the course of a month working together, and I came to understand how he felt. You see, when you say someone is black, it isn't because they are. It's typically motive driven on your part to show your diversity and acceptance to friends, or more likely to set up a stereotype in your head to get the response you are expecting. Wow. He was totally right. I will also say that after I told the story of Marcus wanting to watch Soul Train and Mod Squad like his friends, but his granny made him watch Hee Haw, he knew why I had to say he was black. But mind-blowingly, I had never considered this concept before. But back to my message. Now it's as if the MAGA movement has co-opted the opinions and rhetoric of some of the America's greatest black minds. The bourgeoisie and intelligentsia of African American society had many voices speaking out against the othering of black society. They believed that by separating us, it continued the narrative set in motion by the WASP culture. Of course, their end goal was to further our understanding and not to divide us like we are witnessing today. Seriously, y'all, this is why we cannot disengage. Even as we all sit here thinking how loving and open we are, none of us have dissected much of what it would really have to take for bottom to top change. The Constitution itself was formulated for the political, cultural, and economic interests of a particular ethnic group, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Professor Williams wrote, "This perspective of the predominant group, which never calls itself ethnic, is how everyone else gets designated as ethnic, special interests, or others. If we look at the base of it, this entrenched power reveals integrationism is perforce assimilation. This power is incapable of critiquing itself or the current institutions, values, and such without undermining its strategic function, making those who try to change the system from within unable to see the radical systemic changes mean we need to change the processes that allowed them to get there. In other words, people that become educated and strive for better become part of the system that everyone is reaching for, and therefore they can never tear down the systems that got them there. I believe this is where the Clarence Thomases and Candace Owens come from. This idea that the continued othering of those in our society only further the ideas of our differences. By placing citizens in groups, it appears to give privilege and does nothing for correcting the past. This may be true, but I wholeheartedly disagree that the solution is just to forget the past and move forward. In my lifetime, I have seen many countries fall and recreate, beginning anew, sometimes for the better, but many not. It makes me ponder, what would our new Constitution look like? Would we remove these systemic barriers that continue to divide us? Could we dispose of the Electoral College? Is it possible we could see past our colonial beginnings? Is it possible to govern without the otherness? It hasn't been done yet, but as a die-hard Trekkie, I keep my hope alive that humanity may one day live as one. But back to my questions around Black History Month, I, for one, am in the camp of yes. I don't fully profess to understand how it subconsciously affects Americans and their political views. I do get the opposition to otherness, but I am not of the bourgeoisie or intelligentsia elite. I do not consider awareness as systemic othering. As these days roll around, I try to become even more informed and spread it around. I use it to reflect on my memories and hope that it may help my friends and family to be more equipped to self-govern in the real world. To know our history and how people unlike ourselves have lived. I hope I have done that for you today. So for now, I will use the reminder every year to remember Miss Kitty and Jody. It will remind me to think of Carla and the frogs and Ronald with our little finch in the backyard. I will take time to acknowledge my privilege of being educated without the stained history of America's past. I will, in my own way, try to bring everyone on my walk through humanity. I look forward to the day when we can all do the same. Thank you.